WTF? Huh? Yeah, it's not. The screen's not working. What's going on here? How's the day been so far, folks? While I try to fix this. Nobody has any feelings on that? Testing. How's the audio, Calgary? Audio check. Video seems to be a bit tricky, just strange. It was working this morning, now what? What could it be? Sometimes you just, you just gotta like blow into it. Hopefully that works. Let me try on this side. Come on. I see a change here. I don't see it picking up there. Come on. Okay, let me try and get a different dongle. Do you have one? But that's not USB-C, is it? Okay, I'm gonna go to my desk and grab one. Sorry, folks. I'll be back. Just in time-ish. I just have to get my dongle thing. Always do. Well, the dongle's there, it's just not working. It's broken. Or maybe it's something else. Yeah, true. Hopefully this works. All right, we're in business. And hopefully everything is good here. Looks like you guys can see it. How has the day been going so far?
Trying that one again.
Yeah, exactly. What is it now, right now? 3:11? Okay, we're 10 minutes past the start time, so let's see if we can get it done by 4. If not, we'll go to 4:10. Today, we'll talk about 2 things in Breakout, which will be ambitious. One is the actual schedule for the Breakout, which is looking at this new syntax that you've already kind of started using already, that you saw in lecture today as well, which is some of the quote-unquote new features in JavaScript, or new-ish features in JavaScript that we're now getting you to use more. So they're listed here. how we define variables. Already did a little bit of that, but I kind of skipped it in lecture in terms of like explaining. For of, for in terms of looping strategies, arrow functions, and template strings. There's a bunch of other stuff in ES6 that we could go into but won't yet because we believe in just-in-time learning. So, learn it when it's relevant, as much as possible anyway, right? You could have asked the question during the prep course, and maybe you did. I'm curious. Did people, as they were going through the prep course or week 1 material, come across some of these things in other resources out there that either we linked to or you just came across in your own research? Things like let and const, things like arrow functions or template strings. Did they come up? Right, so that probably led to a little bit of confusion, I'm guessing. Like, hey, how come we're using var in our prep course, but a lot of places online I'm seeing const or let, or the same thing with anonymous functions.
We get a poll which of those actually came up.
Sorry?
We get a poll on which of those came up.
Can we get a poll in terms of which or who experienced them?
No, I don't really care. I don't know which ones came up.
Oh, okay. Sure. For Calgary's sake, Jeremy wants to get a poll on which ones came up. So let const and var, hands please in terms of that came up before today in week 1 or prep. You're interested in week 1 or prep, right?
Yeah.
So what, about half of you only, or are the other half just not sure? A majority in this room anyway. I don't care as much about use strict, so we'll skip that one. For of or for in for looping? Less than half. Arrow functions for anonymous inline functions? Half of you noticed it? Now, out of curiosity with that one, since it's half of you, is it through other readings? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. And template strings. About a third, about a quarter of the room, very few people, 4 or 5 people in Vancouver at least. Unfortunately, on Calgary is actually saying yes for fours, one of them said, but ignored them. Yes for arrow, yes for arrow, yes for template strings. So I think generally across the board, yes on most things to a certain degree.
Not much template. That are for, that makes sense. Thank you for
Okay. I mean, I only want to spend time on things that people feel that I should be spending time on up here. We only get an hour together. And I did want to throw in the other part of this is the stuff that I didn't get to in lecture, which is relevant-ish to what you're doing with TinyApp, which is middleware in terms of how Express works a little bit more internally. You may or may not need to know it to its full degree to get TinyApp done. But it's not just about getting TinyApp done, right? It's about understanding the things that we're working with. So I'm going to try and throw in there as the latter half some Express middleware conversations. Hey, Franklin. Please don't chew any wires. Any kind of thoughts before I start in terms of the list that I have? Anything that I should have on there that I don't? Or anything that I should emphasize more as we talk about these things? I see that somebody's saying your name, sorry? Benson? Spencer. I don't know how I heard Benson. Bad hearing. Spencer? Yeah. That right? Well, so what was it again? Spencer. Hopefully that's right. Has said use strict is something I'd like to see talked about a little bit more today because I see it everywhere, but I haven't used it yet. Yeah. Others? Can maybe move that one up? In case we have to just cut something for the interest of time, I'm prioritizing, right? Template string I've kept last for that reason. It's fairly straightforward. We covered it this morning. And at least for me, but I shouldn't maybe say that because it's an assumption. If you feel that template strings is something you want to cover, I'm happy to. I won't judge you, I promise. Anything else? Okay, for of and for in have been moved up. These two? Yeah, we can. I don't have a really good example for it, unfortunately, but I can try and conjure one really quickly while we're lecturing or figure something out. I feel underprepared on the error functions in this side, but we'll see how that goes. Anything else? Cool. So let's start. WTF ustrict, right? What is this for? Does anybody want to actually start off with their knowledge of ustrict? Does it limit type coercion amongst other things? I actually don't know if it limits type coercion. Do you know, Jeremy? I don't know either. So we could discover that together. That'll be a fun exercise. It does other things that are similar to that in terms of being strict, as you can imagine, based on the name.
If it does, it's going to be pretty limited. It's going to be lots of type coercions anyway.
I don't imagine it does any kind of type coercion change, but tell me if you find otherwise. Yep.
I know that one of its purposes is to protect the future of your application so that it preserves words that may become used later in JavaScript. The specific words that it's concerned about is not the future of those. And it also protects the compatibility of going back to the code.
It helps you with any future proofing of your code, with any keywords that may be coming up, you're saying?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That sounds really interesting. Cool. So, like, is there an example that you have on that you've read?
There is a list of reserved words that I saw. I won't forget.
Cool. That sounds like something it should be doing. So I accept that. I care less about it, I guess. Also, as you know, because I didn't know about it. What else? And so you said something else as well, right? That was it? Yeah. Well, clearly I don't know a lot. So what the hell am I doing up here? Maybe a question you might be asking yourself. Any others before I go into it? Okay. So the biggest thing, in my opinion, that ustrict ought to be used for in your code, and you can start using it. You could have started using it from the beginning, and you can start using it for this project, is avoiding a very critical mistake that happens even with seasoned developers that use JavaScript, which is accidentally declaring variables instead of assigning values to existing variables. The common mistake that I think have already warned you of, which can happen very easily if I do something like that without using the keyword var, let, or const. Ustrict does not allow this at all. What happens in this situation? It becomes a property of some global object. In the browser, that's window. There's no window in Node because there is no browser window. But there is and your name starts with an S. Sebastian says it becomes a property of the global object, as we see here. And so this is likely unintentional. And if you want it to be unintentional, well, why the hell wouldn't you just say global.a in the rare occasion where you actually want that, right? And so this is like something that's just been like a mistake, you could argue, a design choice that wasn't really necessarily beneficial to anybody and just really led to confusion and debugging challenges, right? Are you guys with me on that statement? Most of you, yes? Seems like a little bit unexpected and unnecessary that a equals 1 creates an A, although yes, fewer keywords, fewer characters being typed, as opposed to just complaining that, hey, you haven't really what do you want A to be? Do you want it to be a constant? Do you want it to be a variable? Which scope do you want it to be in? Are you using var, let, something, tell me something. And so ustrict, just that reason alone is a good reason to use ustrict in pretty much everything that you write. Now, I believe that many projects, you said you saw it in a lot of projects in the code base. I thought, and again, I'm not as familiar with all of the many production code bases out there in JavaScript, but I thought that you can do it so that it can automatically add uScript as it's running the code. So because it's kind of ugly to just have uScript at the very beginning. Actually, let me demonstrate first. So let's actually create a file in this directory, the same lecture directory that I had before. We'll just call it 3, I guess. And in here, I can do a equals 1 console log a, as we demonstrated in the REPL. And that works because it's done global.a. And when I say a, it doesn't find it. It's able to find it in the global.a, even though that's not explicitly mentioned here, which is confusing, right? So essentially, this is the same thing as global.a, a being our variable name, of course, right? So these are the same, and that's how this is working, which is the confusion. If you do uScript, strict, I should say, it's just a string at the very beginning. Then it actually changes the node interpreter to go into strict mode. And in strict mode, one of the things that happens is it doesn't allow this. So now, what I expect to happen is an error at line 3. Line 3 in my file, the error is a is not defined. You cannot assign to a. It doesn't talk about strict mode or anything. It just behaves how it wishes JavaScript ought to have behaved from the beginning. So it doesn't give you a hint about why this is happening all of a sudden in your code. It assumes you know that that's because of strict mode. This is the biggest, kind of to me, the biggest value of uStrict. There is one more that's kind of like, yeah, this is important too, but not as important, that I would like to talk about, which is this confusion around the keyword this, which we've covered a little bit in week 1, right? Still don't probably have a full grasp on it. Hell, I don't have a full grasp on it. And it's true that many senior developers, quote unquote, that have been working with JavaScript for a while, kind of skirt by without like a full understanding of this. So don't feel guilty, even if like by the time you graduate, you're not able to teach someone about this. I can definitely empathize with that. I know that we, Jeremy, myself, and others, Sam, have definitely struggled, maybe a strong word, but definitely like had our challenges with teaching this properly, and we still haven't figured it out in our curriculum. We don't even know if it's necessarily what is the right level for a bootcamp grad to be at when it comes to this, like the keyword this. Should they have a full mastery of it? Because many senior developers don't. In terms of JavaScript, Sam seems to be holding back a laugh, but I don't know if that's just because he's always laughing. I have a great audience today. 2 critics. 2 students. Give me a break. Give me a break. I should be learning from you. No questions from Calgary so far, but let me continue on with what I meant about this. So I was able to just say this in here, like without any kind of, I wasn't in a function. I wasn't, especially in a method, which is where we learned about this, right? If we recall from week 1, it was in the music library, where we were able to say like this dot playlist, and we were in an object, and this logically made reference to the playlist object that the method was on. Do you recall? I wish I had that code brought up, but in your memory, does that ring a bell? So like methods, when you call them, methods mean it's a function on an object, right? So when you call it, it can say this to refer to its object. And so they can say like this dot some other property, right? Here, it's like, what the hell does this refer to? It's confusing, right? So if I can do it in the REPL right at the very top, that means that if I create a file, this.js, and I go into it, I should be able to console log this. And the exact same thing would happen, or nearly the exact same thing, where I would see this crazy object. Nearly the exact same thing, right? Don't worry about the fact that it's like a smaller object versus the bigger one that we saw earlier. It's just a slight internal implementation difference. Okay? So we have this like thing. I guess it's an object, so I guess I can do things like this dot a equals 1, and console.log this again. Let's see what happens, right? What do you expect in that case to have happened? Yeah, it seems like it was an empty object when I ran it, and so now it should be an object with one property when I ran it. And that property should be A pointing to 1. That's how I expect objects to behave, but I don't really understand what the hell's happening with this at this level, right? And so this confusion with this is not a concern, I believe, when you use ustrict. What it basically says is when you console log this, or not console log, but when you refer to this in the in a scope where it's not a method in an object, I'll say for now, it'll just be not what I expect. Oops, sorry, I put a semicolon in there. Still not what I expect. Maybe it's actually when you're in a function, my bad. So let's try this example instead. Here, it's not a method, it's just a function in the quote-unquote global scope, right? It's not a method or anything on an object. And I call hello. Yeah, so sorry, this is where it actually becomes a difference, as opposed to before, it's the thing I was showing you earlier, where before this actually means something if you're not using strict mode, when it really shouldn't because it's confusing. It's, I think, referring to the global object here, or the window object if you're in DevTools. But if you call it with strict mode, it doesn't bind this on functions that are not methods, let's say. I think personally this is going a little bit too far in this explanation. As you saw, even I was confused a little bit. So this is one difference. If you don't recall it, don't worry about it. If you do end up in a situation where this is behaving differently than what documentation is telling you, then perhaps ustrict is the reason. Perhaps. Maybe that's something you ought to recall. Is that a fair enough entryway into ustrict? I see a lot of blank faces. So maybe, Jeremy, you want to throw something in there?
I might add a simplification there. If you can tell the difference whether you're using strict or not, then I probably think your code is wrong.
I like that.
I think the way you should be coding.
I'll repeat it for Calgary eventually.
Yeah, I think the way you should be coding is following all the ustrict rules, whether they're present or not. So if you can tell, I probably would change your code. And I think Katie, Sam, I think Carl, I think all the senior managers would agree with the style recommendations and use.
Even though we don't necessarily know all of the detailed ustrict details, the main one being the one that I introduced earlier of variable creation, a equals 1, should be avoided in your code. And if you need to have a check that's constantly telling you, hey, you can't do that because you make that mistake, well, probably let's assume you're going to do that. Then just use ustrict, is what Jeremy's saying, in other words.
Yeah.
Right? So it kind of is a good lint check for you, essentially. Hopefully that wasn't too half-assed of an explanation. How was I? Is that okay? For now? Cool. So where were we with our plan? Anything from Calgary? Nothing yet. So for of and for in. Anybody want to take a first stab at that one? Say that again. I don't know. Where did you get that? I should probably write it this way. So far you've used what for looping over values that already exist. I'll get back to whether that's right or not. So far, what have you been using to iterate over values? Let's say you have an array of things. What have you been using? For each has been our go-to, and before that we used the more powerful but more verbose C-style for loop, right? For var or let or const I equals whatever. I don't know if const would actually work in that. I think it might fail. But anyway, for var or let I equals 0, I is less than some value or greater than some value or some kind of condition, I plus plus or something like that, which gives you a lot more control over how you're iterating, but isn't syntactically as nice to read. Yeah? And so you went from that to for each. I believe for each was introduced in ES6, I want to say, but I could be wrong. And then ES6 introduced these two for loops to make it even nicer of a language to read as like first-class things in the language. The first one, and the most common one that you'll be using, as you alluded to, remember your name again? Benji alluded to, is for of. Because normally when you're looping, I'd say more than 50% of the time, it's on a iterable, it's on a array of some sort, a collection. And so for of is the one that if you're not sure which one you want to use, it's likely for of. And it took me a while when I first started using these to remember which one's which. It's kind of confusing. Because you could argue, and other languages have for in for arrays. And so that threw me for a loop, no pun intended. But for of is what JavaScript says you should use for arrays. And so that's the one you're likely going to be using most of the time. Although not in Titanium. So for let, first we need an array. So we can have a const data equal, just keep something simple, not too creative. You've got your data for let, num of data. And then you've got your simple loop there without having to worry about. What does for each require? It requires a callback function. It's a little bit more cognitive load, maybe, one could argue, like a little bit extra thinking, nesting that we have to think about in terms of scope. Here, arguably less so, and it reads a little bit nicer. Mechanically also is different, right, in terms of how it's implemented in Node, but we don't care about that as much. So let's just make sure this is working. I'm console logging, and I'm on file 5. Oops. Actually, before I run it, and I didn't run it yet, expectation, what is this going to do? Hopefully, this will just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on separate lines each. So let's run it. And there we have it. Now, I could choose to use var, but one of the things you read in your reading today, I know we haven't talked about it in the breakout yet, but you've probably already read it, which is, with regards to var, avoid it unless it's legacy code and you want to use it as a way of separating legacy code from not. Legacy code meaning stuff that you have inherited or wrote a while back that is written with older version of JavaScript. You can expect to land some kind of gig where you will experience var-based, ES5-based code. And so you can use it as a way of like remembering whether you're in new JavaScript or old JavaScript. But generally, you want to stick to let, if not const. In actually this case, I believe initially let didn't work, but it does work now. I'm not sure if it didn't work or not, but sorry, const didn't work before, but I believe it works now. So you can actually use const here as well in order to loop through these items. Do you think that would work? Exactly. So it seems like some people here at least know that with const, you cannot re-bind that variable or re-assign that variable. Because what this is doing is num equals num plus 1, which is a reassignment on that variable. Even though it seems like you're just incrementing it by 1, you're actually reassigning a value to it, right? And so I expect an error there that the const cannot be reassigned. Plus plus doesn't have an equal sign in it, Jeremy says, so maybe that will work. My assumption slash hypothesis would be that that is not going to work because it's it's a shorter way of saying plus equals 1. And so we see that same behavior, but what he's doing though is the thing I talked about this morning, right? Experimenting, exactly. I'm not sure. I could read documentation. It's quicker in this case to just try this out in a REPL or in the file that I'm in already. It's a really good habit to have versus taking things for granted. Awkward pause for questions or comments. As Benji said, we use for of for arrays and for in for objects.
You never use for in on an array,
Jeremy's throwing me a curveball asking me, do you never use for in on an array? The right answer would be, I've tried it and I know the results, but I actually haven't, at least not in recent memory. So we could try it together and see, but let's try it on an object first and then let's see what happens if we use it on an array. Because again, experimenting to see what the hell happens if we did end up accidentally using it. Because again, just like this morning, let's reproduce those weird situations to see if it's an error so that we can get an error on our own terms or get some unexpected behavior on our own terms versus when we're not expecting it. That's an assumption. I don't know. I can make assumptions too. But let's first do the good approach on it. So let's start with an object. So const, I don't know, maybe being a bit self-centered here, const kv equals, sorry for the lack of creativity here. And lack of being able to type. Laced. I think I'm 35. Either 34 or 35. It's one of those. Let's leave it there. For const val is what we can call it for now. Instead of using of, we're going to use in kv, right? And we're just going to console log val. Does that seem right? What happens when I run this? Oh yeah, thanks. Good catch, Sebastian. I said your name right, right? Yeah, sweet. Terrible with names these days. So you said it was going to break because of this, but let's talk about this now. Thanks for fixing that for us. It should output, you're saying first name, last name, age in different lines. Let's try it. You know what? Let's comment this out because I don't want to see that output. So it seems to basically loop through what? The keys for each of the properties that exist on the object. Very good choice of word, by the way. It loops through the keys, because if you had said it loops through the properties, yes, it does, specifically the keys of each of those properties, right? But also acceptable. So if I actually want to get the value, so first of all, is this a good name for this? No, right? Maybe it should actually be key instead, because that's misleading as a variable name. What do you mean by good choice for thinking? You were saying it's a good choice for thinking?
Yeah, because before we have to run it, you trick us.
I was tricking, exactly, yeah. But nobody really got tricked, it seemed. So if I want to actually, of course, then get the value for that, I have the key. What do? kv.key. Well, why can't I do that? Remember this from this morning? Key is a string, and therefore it's a dynamic value, and so we're going to use square brackets to access the object. Quick review of week 1 there, right? And so now I can say this key points to this value, right? So far, so good? So what are the takeaways there? Pretty much going forward, if you're looping through an array, you're probably better off if you're writing more modern code in terms of JavaScript. For each is still acceptable. It's not going anywhere. Neither is that old school kind of more powerful for loop that gives you a lot more control with the incrementing and the counter itself and things of that nature. They're not going anywhere. So, and there's use cases for those. However, likely for each in almost every situation can be replaced with the for of, right? I don't see where there would be a for each needed where you can have, you can just use for of. Can you guys think of one? Jeremy, anybody? Yep.
For which?
Using for of instead of for each should just be a thing now. I can't think of a situation where you would need to use for each as the call, like the array dot for each, as the way of looping from the beginning to the end of an array. You have a question or a comment?
Oh, yeah, I can easily think of one. Reloaded. Anything, Spencer?
I don't know, Gary. I'm just sitting over here.
Sometimes you want the index.
Ah, yes. Sometimes you want the index. I forgot about that.
I would still never use for each because I think for each is a mistake, but for of might not be the right choice.
Yeah, so if you did want to use the index, which is the second argument, I believe, for each, then you can use the callback version and do the loop that way. Good point.
The Airbnb style guide that we looked into in the beginning says that you should never use for it for because they're broken. Because iterators in current JavaScript broke.
Mm.
No idea why. But they say that you should always use for it.
So your comment is the Airbnb style guide actually tells you not to use these two ES6 constructs for in and for of. And we actually refer you to the Airbnb style guide, so that's a bit of a conundrum. Because they're broken, I'm not exactly sure in what way. I haven't really looked into that. So I'd be curious about that too. I imagine that they're likely broken in some like really bizarre scenario that's not likely to hit unless you're maybe doing more advanced things, like modifying the actual thing that you're looping over as you're looping over it. Race conditions or like things where you're like you have multiple threads accessing or manipulating data that you're trying to loop over is my guess.
Do you know the core before work well? So I don't really know anything about trying to using Babel and stuff like back in ES5 and how that also.
I actually don't know if, I don't know. I don't know if they get transpiled to something else in terms of Babel or if they don't. I don't think they, I don't know. What I'll say about the Airbnb style guide though is that it has some things that, the problem with the JavaScript community is that there is quite a bit of like, we believe this versus that, and there's oftentimes like a 50-50 split. For example, for a while, they've changed it now. The Airbnb style guide said, when you're dealing with anonymous functions, don't deal with anonymous functions. When you're writing a function in an anonymous way, actually give it a name. They since removed that because there was a lot of confusion in that call. So basically, if you are doing something like a for each, and you have a function in here, and arrow functions can never have a name, so I have to use it this way. They would say, actually, this is bad practice, even though this is what most of the community was doing. They were saying, no, give it like a name. I don't know, give it a name that's something else. That's really bizarre. They had a reason for it. I'm not going to get into it. But that reason was very tied to like the current situation of the node runtime. And similar to what you were just saying, it's like very tied to the current implementation, which could be fixed next month. It could be fixed tomorrow. So really, I don't know how seriously you want to take that feedback from them, right? So they see it as a living doc. You can see it that way too, or you can pretend not to see that part of it. Right, so let's not talk about that during this lecture because that's just going to throw me and everybody else for a loop. For now, we can kind of operate with the understanding that 4 of, 4 in are kosher. We're going to use them. And, take some of those things with a grain of salt. Keep them in the back of your mind. Is that cool? Awesome. Arrow functions. We'll call it 6 arrow. Oh shit, yeah, I forgot about that. Sorry. What happens, before we get to arrow functions, what happens when we use for in on an array? So we have an array at the top there, data. And we'll call it val here. What happens when you do that? I may have tried this a while back. I haven't recently, so I would only have an assumption. Do you guys know? Have you guys tried this? Laptop just lights on fire? I have no idea. Let's try it. So I'll comment this one out. We've already commented the one on top, so this is the only output that we see. 5. Any other assumptions before we, any other guesses before we run it? Oh shit, sorry. Well, I'm not creating, I guess I'm updating, so I wouldn't have lost anything, but thanks for pointing that out. Any other assumptions? So it went through 0 all the way to 4. What does that look like? So just to confirm, like if I change this, I'm going to get the same output. Does anybody know what's going on there? Your keys are essentially numbers? Something like that? Remember this morning we talked about associative array, kind of threw that word out there for objects. And then I threw out the word map as another way to think about associative arrays. I mean, you could think about the map or object as just the keys are string values, or in the case of arrays, the keys are, how do we still use square brackets, right? We just don't use dot notation. But we use square brackets, just like with objects, but we use integer or numbers to retrieve elements, right? So from an API perspective, you're dealing with, Jeremy has something else he wants to correct on that?
This is a bit of a what's the right level of detail for a bootcamp student.
Sure. We'll spend a minute on it.
Run a type up on those.
Well, you'll get back. Actually, depends on the runtime, I think. Okay. So a type of on an object.
No, in the for in loop, type of that val.
Oh, interesting. So it'll actually be a string, you're saying?
Because
Oops.
it's not a function. Oh, does it work? Wait, what?
Yeah, type of is a.
Type of's an operator, maybe.
Yeah, but this will work. So string. Yeah, you're right.
And the reason that matters is because suppose you, which you probably shouldn't do for style reasons, but you might test if the index is equal to some number that's the number you're looking for. And you might follow my strenuous advice to only use triple equals. If you do both those things, you're gonna have a bad time. So it's kind of too much detail, but at the same time. Why? We should probably stop. Detail is very good, especially because Calgary can't hear me.
I guess I'll leave it here. I find this, like, this is, for me, too much detail to the point where, like, I shouldn't have to worry about this.
I mean, I've gotten bitten by this. I don't even write down a code, and I've been bitten by this more than once. That's why I know about it and remind myself.
Okay, fair point. We're at 3:53. I have 20 minutes with you guys at most if I'm stretching it. Let me see here. Template strings we're not covering. We'll talk about arrow functions hopefully in the next 10 minutes, and then we'll hopefully spend 10 minutes on middleware. I apologize. So arrow functions. The easiest example that I can think of is using, so first of all, arrow functions are always anonymous functions, as we saw earlier today, where I was always using them as callback functions. And second, I mentioned in the lecture earlier this morning that, like, there's just slight difference in terms of how they behave with function expressions that you use traditionally, and it has to do with their scope and how they handle this, right? So the easiest example that I can probably use is maybe to define an array where we're going to actually loop through that array, or maybe call map on that array. And then we can do this. But you know, the problem is I don't have an example where I can use this, unless Jeremy, you can think of one. But let me just show you the actual syntax first. Let's say I want to loop through that array and create a new array that is new values. Each value is basically the square of the value that's already in there. So I'm going to multiply each item as I go through the array by itself, and then I'm going to have a new array that represents those squared values. Right? So this is the map function, allows me to do that, so that I don't have to do each and keep a separate array and whatever. We're not here to talk about map, but you know, we're using it in this example. So let's just make sure that works. I expect to get an array back that's going to be, you know, 1, 4, and so on and so forth. Oops, running the wrong file. Make sense? I guess the ES6 way of writing this in a very quick manner, that's less keywords, less characters, is to remove the keyword function and just use the arrow to point to our function. And then you end up with an arrow function that does exactly the same thing. And taking it a step further in JavaScript, you can actually go, I'll just leave it in there, I guess, even simpler. And if it's something as simple as like a one-line arrow function, you can eliminate the parentheses, the curly brackets, and the return. And you end up with a very kind of simple inline function that's one-liner, which is sometimes the case. You know, you're doing some simple operation over a bunch of values. That's one line. This is the, I know it's not showing up completely, so I'm just going to bring it in here. There we go. This is the kind of most quote-unquote elegant way of writing the one-line anonymous function that's likely being used as a callback function, right? But that's not speaking to the difference between arrow functions and using function expressions, as we saw earlier. The difference, if I bring it back to the curly bracket version, is what happens when I Let's just console log it in here as we're going through on this. So what do you think will happen here based on your assumption? Yeah? Because it might not rebind this to anything substantial.
I didn't write exactly the same experiment, but I ran roughly the same experiment and did the same.
So I got back. Oh, I should probably use ustrict here. Although I don't think that's the reason for what just happened. No. So in this case, this might be a bad example to actually talk about this. I think so. Let's try it. Oops. Nope, different behavior, but very confusing nonetheless. Okay, well, let's do a more practical example when it comes to comparing this versus not using this. So instead, you have an object, and you have functions on the object using properties, right? Here, we can return using a regular function expression. We can return the object's full name using other properties using this. This is very similar to what we did with the music library, if you recall. So now if I do console.log kv.fullName, what do I expect will happen? I'm going to get the full name working correctly. Right? Whoops. I need to actually call the function, don't I? Otherwise, it's just going to say, hey, that's a function. So I get back kv, right? It's in scenarios like this where if I use an arrow function here, it's not going to work in the same way as a function expression. So arrow functions aren't meant to be used in situations where you actually want this to be bound to the object within which a method is called, for example. So the definition of an arrow function is one that it's a anonymous function that doesn't rebind this. So it doesn't affect the value of this. Yep.
Or do you get like yeah, you don't get the global object, but you're in
Yeah, so that's why you're getting, actually that might be why you're actually not getting an error, because you're not calling, this is not undefined, this is some kind of global object. So perhaps if fname existed on the global object, then perhaps that would actually not be undefined, but actually be a value.
That's interesting, but when you console log this by itself in an arrow, you get an empty object, not the global object.
But remember that we saw that difference when we did it with Node as well. We're again going a little bit off track here, but we saw the same problem when we did, if I just console log this up here, without using ustrict, no, you get an empty object. And so my guess is that here, this is actually referring to that same object. And that's why you're getting undefined here. So to make things confusing, if I do this, that might be what actually ends up being the f name that gets console logged here, I think. Yeah. Don't worry if you didn't understand that part. The main thing to take away here is that arrow functions have a very different behavior on how this works. That is the really, and also they cannot be named, whereas function expressions can be named. But mainly it's the value of this that's very different. I don't expect you after Breakout to be able to fully grasp that, but it's something to just keep in the back of your mind and experiment with. Oh, Calgary has a question. Would this .f name in this case be the same as kv.f name? So in here, can I do, instead of this, I shouldn't say this, instead of this line of code here, can I instead use kv.f name over here? Thoughts on this is what I think Kenzie is asking. Will this work? And let me just get rid of this confusing line at the top here. These two confusing lines. Are we going to see the F and the L name show up here? Yes, no, don't care. Yes, why yes? This function you're assuming, you're saying yes if you assume that this function has access to the outer scope where kv is defined. And so when I call it, it has access to the scope in which it's being called in order to access kv. Right? And the scope in which it was, what did I say? Did I say something different? Sorry, the scope in which it was defined. But is this good practice? Generally speaking, this is not good practice. Generally speaking, you've essentially made this function now dependent on, like, it's making an assumption on what this object is actually being referred to where it's defined. And so it's a little bit more coupled with the outer scope. And which is why the keyword this exists in the first place, so that you don't have to know the name of the thing that it belongs to. Right? So the solution here is to, if you need to access other properties on this object, you should be using this, in which case you should not be using arrow functions for those functions, for those methods. I'm going to leave it as this for the example here. Okay, we're at 4:06, which means I have 4 minutes instead of 10 to talk about, instead of 20, which is what I had estimated, in order to talk about middleware and Express. I don't know if that's long enough, and I might not do it justice if I do that. I would rather it be left for tomorrow's lecture, I think, because I don't think this will be a hindrance to you in terms of what you're doing today. Is that okay? Cool. So takeaways, start using useStrict in your files. You might as well. Hopefully nothing will break when you start doing that. It'll just be a string that you include at the very top of each file that you have, JavaScript file. And unless you need the index of the array that you're looping over, use for/of. And instead of var, use let. Ideally use const as much as possible, and use let where you need to rebind, which is rare. Use arrow functions unless you need to use this on anonymous functions. That one's a little bit more opinionated. I don't know if I like arrow functions more or less. That's a personal thing. Any questions or last kind of closing thoughts or anything like that? Okay, awesome. I'll send out notes. The notes I'm going to actually send out, I'm going to take from Stosh in Toronto, I think, is the one that sent out those notes. I read them earlier today. They're really good. They actually go a little bit into the history of JavaScript, which I didn't cover, that he ends up spending 5 or 10 minutes on. So it's a really interesting read. So those notes will be in your email, and I think they'll cover a little bit more than what we already talked about, but they'll also cover the things we talked about. Cool beans? Awesome. Enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with the URL shortener stuff. Hey. How you doing? Good, good. Let me just turn off the stream here. I just finished lecture.